In the primary source, A Brief Relation unto Maryland, we learn about the savages, who we have identified as the Native Americans, the first people in America. Native Americans were the first people to live in North America. The first Indians came from Asia to North America thousands of years ago. They built villages near rivers. They hunted animals and gathered plants and seeds to eat. They learned where to find how and to make everything they need in nature. Later, people learned to farm the land. Some Native Americans still live in Maryland today. They are part of our state's rich history. And if you think about it, that's similar to the geography concepts we talked about. The necessity of water and rivers and the areas good for farming and buildings and factories, and the importance of the Chesapeake Bay and importing and exporting goods. Many scientists have a theory or possible explanation based on facts about how the first people came to North America. Scientists believe that they arrived on foot thousands of years ago. This period was called the Ice Age because the climate was so cold. The level of oceans was much lower than it is today. The water was so low that a land bridge connected Asia to North America. Today, the land bridge is beneath the sea. We do not know much about the people who lived during the prehistoric times. Prehistoric means before history was written down. Scientists get information about how people lived and about what kinds of tools they used from artifacts. However, most artifacts do not give information about what kind of language the people spoke or what the beliefs were. Paleo-Indians. We call the first people who lived in North America Paleo-Indians. Paleo means ancient or very old. Scientists believe that the people reached the land we call Maryland about 14,000 years ago. At the time, large, slow-moving sheets of ice called glaciers covered much of the land north of Maryland. The area where the Chesapeake Bay is today was a river valley. The climate was cold. Giant animals such as woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers lived in the grasslands that spread across the land. The Paleo-Indians were hunter-gatherers. They hunted the huge animals as well as smaller animals like white-tailed deer. They also caught fish from the rivers. They gathered berries, nuts, leaves, and roots from plants. Paleo-Indians made tools from stone. They used very hard stones to chip out stones until they had sharp edges. They made knives and points for their spears. They made scrapers to scrape animal hide that they wore as clothing. They also made a tool called an atlatl that helped hunters throw the spears. Over time, the climate warms. As time passed, the climate in North America began to change. The temperature got warmer and glaciers began to melt. The water formed new rivers and lakes. Water filled the Susquehanna River Valley and formed the Chesapeake Bay. More trees grew. Many giant animals became extinct. They may not have been able to live in the warmer climate, or perhaps the people hunted too many of them. After the big animals died out, the deer became a major source of food for the people. People also began to harvest shellfish like oysters and clams from the Chesapeake Bay. Another group of Indians from the historic times includes the Archaic Indians. As the natural world changed, people's lifestyles also changed. The Archaic Indians lived after the Paleo-Indians. Archaic Indians developed new skills. Families moved around in search of food, but also still gathered plants for food. They ground seeds and nuts into flour to make a food that was like bread. Like Paleo-Indians, Archaic Indians lived in small groups. They traveled around to get food that was available at different times of the year. The people made spears, fish traps, nets, and canoes. They carved bowls from a soft rock called soapstone. Next, we had the Woodland Indians. The Woodland Indians had a system of government and trade that helped the tribes thrive. Over time, the natural world and the lifestyle of the people changed again. The people who lived in the eastern United States about 3,000 years ago were called Woodland Indians. We know more about the Woodland Indians than we do about earlier peoples who lived in what is now Maryland. Since the woodland Indians lived in recent centuries, more things that the people made are still around for us to study. The first Europeans to arrive in North America also wrote about the people they met here. The woodland Indians' most important new idea was farming. The people still hunted and gathered food, but they began to grow food too. Because they grew crops, they could settle down in one place. They no longer had to travel so much to find enough to eat. Since there was more food, the population grew. Villages, tribes, and nations. Most woodland Indians live in villages, like our towns and cities. Woodland villages had names. The people of the village were part of a larger group called a tribe. Members of the tribe shared a way of life and common language. Many tribes spoke similar languages. Sometimes these tribes joined together in larger groups called nations. In the land we call Maryland, there were several woodland tribes. The largest group on the eastern shore was called the Nanticotes tribe. Smaller tribes became their allies. They agreed to protect each other and work together. The largest tribe on the western shore was the Piscataway. They also had smaller tribes as allies. At certain times in history, Shawnee Indians lived in western Maryland. The Piscataways, Nanticotes, and Shawnees all spoke languages in the Algonquin family. Farther north were the Susquehannocks. Their language was different from the other tribes. It was part of the Iroquois language family. However, the Susquehannocks were not part of the large Iroquois nation. Susquehannocks built villages along the Susquehanna River in what is now Pennsylvania. They have had some villages along the Potomac River. Native Americans live in Maryland today. Several Piscataway groups live in southern Maryland. They plan events and share their culture. A Nanticoke group lives in Delaware. In recent years, Lumbee Indians from North Carolina moved to Baltimore City to work. They, too, want to preserve the culture and share it with the Marylanders. Many people across the state have Indian ancestry. Many Indian groups had a war council and a peace council. Tribes had different ways of governing or ruling themselves. A ruler, sometimes called the chief, was the head of the tribe. Rulers were also called by other names. Most tribes had a peace council and a war council. A council is a group of people that discusses issues. The Nanticotes and Piscataways called their leader a Weronets. Sometimes a woman served as the Weronets. A Tayak was the leader of several towns and tribes. In all woodland tribes, women had some rights and powers. They often helped make decisions. The village councils discussed issues until they could agree on what was best. Rulers had to talk to priests, warriors, and tribal councils before they had to make decisions about or wage of war. Tribes did not always get along with one another. Sometimes two or more tribes wanted to use the same land. When this happened, they went to war. The Susquehannocks were known as fierce fighters. When they hunted, they traveled into territory that the Nanticotes and the Piscataways considered theirs. Sometimes wars broke out between the tribes. Indians lost family members when they went to war. Some people were captured. Prisoners often became slaves. Sometimes a prisoner was given to a family that had lost a member during the fighting. These prisoners had to do the dead person's work.